Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me and my colleagues this afternoon for our very first East Asia seminar series this year. And it is on a hot topic on how China is disrupting the tech world. My name is Diana Fu. I'm the director of the East Asian Seminar Series here at the Asian Institute, part of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the University of Toronto. I'm also a faculty specializing in Chinese politics at Munk and political science. So this afternoon, we have a distinguished panel of guests. So allow me to introduce them before we move on to the program. First, we have Scott Moore, who is a lecturer in political science and also the director of China programs and strategic initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania. Scott and I are both public intellectual fellows also at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Scott is the author of a new book that has been selling very fast called China's Next Act: How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future. It just came out this year, so please get a copy of it. And he's going to be talking about that today. And prior to joining Penn, Dr. Moore was a young professional and water resources management specialist at the World Bank Group, and also an officer for China at the US State Department, where he worked extensively on the Paris Agreement on climate change. Dr. Moore holds a doctoral and master's degrees from Oxford University and an undergraduate degree from Princeton University. We were supposed to also be joined by our fellow China specialist, Anne Caucus, but unfortunately for unforeseen reasons, she is not able to be with us. But she is also the author of a really interesting book called Trafficking Data: How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty, and it's coming out next month. So please take a look at that. And you can read about Anne's biography also on her website. She is the Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. We're also very lucky to have someone joining us from in-house. Lotus Ruan is a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Lotus has looked at the roles of state and private actors in shaping internet governance agendas and digital rights. Her writing has appeared very broadly in both academic journals as well as in very well-known international outlets, including Foreign Policy, Just Security, and Internet Policy Review. So we are so thrilled to welcome both Lotus and Scott to talk about this very timely topic of how China is disrupting the tech world and what can be or what should be done about this. So I want to encourage the audience members also to ask any questions. We will actually leave about 20 minutes, so starting from 4:40 for Q&A, and there is a built-in Q&A feature as part of the Zoom where you can send your questions and I will moderate the questions. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Scott and Lotus.
Thank you so much, Diana, for the introduction and for inviting me to the panel. So without further ado, let's dive right in, as we've got lots of interesting topics to cover in a limited amount of time. From state-business relation, US-China rivalry to advanced tech and data privacy, we've got it all. So Scott, in your latest book, you examined everything: China's rise in biotech, climate exchange, public health, and emerging technologies. And you've also explained this indispensable roles of state actors in supporting and advancing China's tech sector in other works that you've done before as well. Yet it almost seems like it's exactly this kind of state involvement that contributes to the widespread thinking that China cannot really innovate due to its political controls, among other things. So could you elaborate a little bit more on the role of state actors in China's tech dominance? Are Chinese tech companies really closely tied to the state, or is it more nuanced according to your research?
Lotus, thanks so much. It's a great question, and I just want to start by thanking you, the Asian Institute, and the Munk School for the chance to have this discussion. I'm really excited about it. As you pointed out, Lotus, we have a lot of ground to cover today, so hopefully we'll be able to at least touch on some of these many complex but also really fascinating issues. And by way of getting to your question and answering it, maybe it's helpful just to kind of say a quick word about kind of the approach I took in the book as a whole. And it really starts from an aspect of my background that was touched on in Diana's gracious introduction, which is that I had the chance to spend a bit of time at the U.S. Department of State with a portfolio that was called Environment, Science, Technology, and Health. And I remember, I had pretty recently come out of graduate school and doing a postdoc into this portfolio, and I remember thinking, wow, that sounds like somewhere between laughable and downright dangerous to expect, one person basically to try to cover so many complex and extremely technical issue areas. And there definitely remains a lot of truth to that. But I will say that over the course of my time at the State Department, and even more so since I left and returned more to an academic setting, and I've had the chance to kind of reflect on this experience, I did become convinced that China's relationship with the United States, many other countries, and even more broadly, its role in the world is increasingly being defined by these two kind of policy arenas of sustainability on one hand, centered primarily on shared global environmental challenges like climate change, and then technology on the other. And that sort of gets, I think, to your question about the role of the state versus non-state and sub-state actors. As you point out, that's something that I do try to touch on a lot in the book, because I think when you're shifting your focus, and that's really the kind of crux of my argument, is that we should be shifting our focus, shifting our thinking, and centering our analysis of China's role in the world, principally in these two issue areas of sustainability and technology. And that one part of doing that, one key way of shifting that focus and rethinking should be to emphasize to a greater degree than is typically the case, the role of non-state and sub-state actors. And partly, I think that's simply a reflection of reality. Unfortunately, government-to-government ties, most obviously between the United States and China, but also several other major countries and China, have become so difficult and so politicized that it's really hard to see how you constructively engage at a government-to-government level on issues like artificial intelligence, or in the case of the US and China, even climate change, after the suspension of climate dialogue following Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So on the one hand, I think it's sort of a reaction to reality, though perhaps not the ideal approach. But on the other hand, I think particularly in when it comes to emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and biotechnology, both things I try to look at in the book, it's also just the case that technology is advancing so quickly that governments and states, whether in Beijing and DC and Brussels or elsewhere, really can't keep up with the progress of those technologies. And so just as a practical matter, it's often individual companies, laboratories, sometimes even individual researchers who are sort of acting as the de facto regulators and sort of just by default setting the norms and standards around development of these new technologies. So I think for those two reasons, and a few others as well, it's really critical that we give a lot more attention to the role of non-state sub-state actors. All that being said, and you pointed this out in your question, it's the role of those actors does look very different in different countries, and certainly in China versus many of the liberal democracies, and particularly in the tech sector. It is the case that a distinguishing kind of feature of China's science, technology, and innovation ecosystem is that there is a much larger role played by the state. That, though, being said, and again, as your question pointed out, I think there's kind of almost a reflexive tendency in policy discussions, certainly on China in the United States, to sort of assume that the Chinese state and Chinese firms, whether it's ByteDance or any other Chinese tech firm, are sort of joined at the hip, and that's just not true. There are certainly more formalized and institutionalized ties between the two than is typical for most tech firms and Western governments, for example. But nonetheless, the interests of Chinese tech firms and China's party and its state frequently differ. In fact, there's a lot more kind of tension than is commonly understood. So that creates, I think, sort of changes the picture when we think about what it means to compete technologically with China. That's, of course, a popular view in the United States, at least, but it also creates challenges for Beijing in implementing and developing policy in the areas of science, technology, and innovation.
That's fascinating, actually, Scott. One of the things I appreciate from what you just said in your book is just the nuanced relationship between state and non-state actors and sub-state actors. I study sort of quite closely with information control, regulation of Chinese social media, and internet governance in general. And definitely state intervention in private companies' day-to-day operation is almost like a recurring theme that caused immense suspicion towards Chinese platform. Well, that's true. As you've pointed out, the relationship between Chinese state and company are definitely way more nuanced and sometimes messy than one would imagine. You've got companies versus government, but also with different level of government and of government agency. And even within the government, there's tough wars among different agencies as well. So I really appreciate the nuance that you just brought to us. But nevertheless, the suspicions have led to many sort of countermeasures, such as TikTok, WeChat bans, which leads to my next question. We've seen so many sort of foreign response to China's perceived growing prowess in tech. In the US specifically, there was the now defunct Trump era DOJ program, the China Initiative, of course, but also the more recent US legislation like the Chips and Science Act. So what do you think? Are they effective? Do we need or ought to advocate for like more state-led efforts to support tech sectors in liberal democracy in order to compete with China on an equal footing?
And just before you answer that, Scott, I said I wouldn't interject, and of course I'm going to interject. You and Lotus both mentioned this point that I think is super important, and I wanted to see if either of you, but particularly Scott, could illustrate, in your research and your experience, one or two moments in which this tension between the Chinese party state and companies really came to light. And I think this is a point that's really important for people who are looking from China from the outside. We think that, because there's party cells and everything, including in businesses, that businesses basically are at the mercy of what the state tells them. And you're saying that, yes, that might be true, that the party penetration is quite high, but it doesn't mean that there's no tensions. It doesn't mean there's no divergent interests at play. And so could you give us, from your research, one or two examples of that might help shed light on this complicated reality on the ground?
Well, I'm happy to take a first stab at that, and then I'll hand it over to Lotus as well for her input. But I think Lotus used the term messy, and I think that's the right word to think about the relationship between Chinese firms and the party and the state. It's messy. It's certainly not necessarily smooth, and there's certainly not a kind of direct principal agent relationship in the way that I think is often assumed, again, at least in the policy kind of world, and at least in the United States. I won't claim to speak beyond that. But ByteDance, I think, actually is one example of that, and one that I do cite in the book, where I quote some ByteDance employees really talking about they actually use the term negotiation. that often takes place with Chinese authorities over things like requests for individual user data in response to law enforcement or other kind of investigative requests. Also, what we would term censorship, kind of issues, that it's actually more of a negotiation where they get, requests / demands from Chinese authorities, but it's not an automatic. It's not like they pull a lever and something in ByteDance responds. These are two different organizations, and they do have channels that exist between them, but that mediate that relationship. And from what I can tell, and I won't claim to have done a comprehensive, kind of study of the Chinese tech sector, there are no doubt firms where other kind of relationships would be at play, but my understanding is that is much more typical of particularly relationships between China's tech sector and the party in the state.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Scott's already mentioned, even in the field of, say, censorship information control, what we're seeing through the work of Citizen Lab and by many others as well, the relationship between private companies and state regulator are actually much more complex and nuanced. I really like the term negotiation. What we're seeing is that instead of like a top-down approach to, say, controlling information or other things, it's actually more of like fragmented and decentralized processes where private companies, even in the same field, they have, say, in the field of censorship, they would have different guidelines and different approach to implementing states of regulation. So definitely a lot of nuances going on in the tech sector.
And incidentally, Diana, it also strikes me in response to your question, but also just to underscore something that you said, Lotus, there's the kind of kind of state society dimension of this, and then there's also the intergovernmental dimension, which Lotus, I think, really highlighted, central local relations. And I think it can't be it can be overstated, but it's often, I think, forgotten that central local relations and subnational governments in China play a really important role in technology policy and innovation as much as in other policy areas like environment. And it's interesting, even once you get into areas like sort of intellectual property protection or theft, actually subnational governments play a significant role, and you see a lot of variation across different jurisdictions in terms of how those issues play out. And I think it's really important to keep that kind of local differentiation in mind.
Yes, yes. And for my students that are out there, we always talk about China as a fragmented authoritarian state, and that is no exception when it comes to the crafting of technology policy. So I'll let Lotus maybe repeat her second question that I interrupted earlier. Your second question for Scott.
I think Scott already answered kind of a little bit, but I'll repeat just so when it comes to China's dominance, we've seen a lot of US, legislation trying to counter the rise of China. For example, the Chips and Science Act. Do you think they're effective, or do you think, like China, we should advocate for a more state-led approach to support tech industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a little more probably that I should try to say in response to that really good question. And sort of a theme that runs through the book is we kind of have this this dilemma or this paradox. And when I say we, I'm thinking, principally of a foreign audience, and particularly those in kind of liberal-leaning democratic countries where China is entirely indispensable to addressing shared global challenges, whether it's climate change, whether it's public health, or whether it's regulating the development of emerging technologies. And yet the kind of default relationship between China and many other countries, and it's sort of an unfortunately growing list, is one of competition, if not something that looks a little closer to conflict. And by the way, it kind of drives me a little nuts that competition always comes up in discussions about China. It's almost never defined. I do sort of try to do that in the book, and happy to talk about that too. But for these purposes, I think it's I'll just sort of bracket that to say that I think, as a practical matter, we have to think about how to address these shared challenges through this kind of framework of competition as well as cooperation or other kind of modes of interaction. And that kind of competition framing, you definitely see shape a lot of US policy. And I think the interesting thing is not just US policy toward China, but a lot of US domestic policy. And the Chips and Science Act is a great example of that. The bill itself, never mentions China, but if you look at the statements of its sponsors, many of the people who voted, and it was a bipartisan piece of legislation passed on a bipartisan basis, virtually all of those statements do reference China and the need for the United States to equip itself to compete more effectively, or to compete at a higher level relative to China. And in particular, China's perceived not exactly advantages, but its investments in attempting to challenge the dominance of other countries in semiconductor manufacture in particular. Although it's worth noting that the Chips and Science Act itself actually does a lot of other things. The semiconductor investments got most of the attention, but there's about half of the legislation that includes pretty significant changes and investments in a whole range of other basic science areas like quantum computing, like artificial intelligence. And again, I think what's significant is that the motivation there for these very substantial federal programs and this investment of resources is really competition with China. Now, will it work? I think, there's certainly a great case to be made that to the extent that the bill results in investments in basic research and development, results in investments in improving the US STEM workforce, or the kind of human capital element of research, science, and technology development. I think it will be beneficial, and I think it will strengthen US competitive advantage. I think to the extent that it ironically replicates some of the more problematic features of China's approach to science, technology, and innovation, like a tendency to over-bureaucratize things and channel resources into just a few areas where the priority is kind of set by the state, it may actually not be very effective. So we'll have to see how it's implemented. But I think while the objective is good, there are some red flags in some specific elements of the Chips and Science Act and other US legislation that's sort of motivated by this competition with China concept.
That's an excellent rundown of what the act means and what the policy implication that it might brought about. I think yesterday I just read an article by Wall Street Journal citing a research done by Asian American Scholar Forum that says, over 1,000 US trained Chinese scientists actually consider or have left US because of fear for US surveillance. So the policy implication that you mentioned about acts like Chips and Science Act definitely has a real world implication. So following up on that, do you think are there still common grounds for collaboration between China and liberal democracy? I really like the phrase you used, the framework of competition. So collaboration within the framework of collaboration. Could you elaborate that a little bit? Like, what are the common grounds that we can pursue and sort of maintain when the tech sector is facing such a hit on the US-China rivalry right now?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. There are some, and there are kind of three things I say about that in the book, or three kind of points I make about how we can encourage cooperation, even as we also try to think about ways to make progress on shared challenges through competition as well. And those three areas are, first of all, I think there are areas that are under kind of exploited or underexplored as areas of cooperation. And perhaps surprisingly or ironically, I actually think areas like biosafety and biosecurity show a lot of promise, at least in principle, for cooperation, even at the governmental level. And that's it's sort of a longer story in some ways, but China is pretty massively exposed to biosafety and biosecurity risks, again, for reasons I can sort of get into. And there are a lot of indications, not least the passage of a very aggressive and in some ways kind of world standard setting biosafety law at the end of last year by China, that Beijing really does take these issues very seriously and is very serious about reform and kind of implementing higher standards that maybe aren't quite in line with international standards and protocols, but get China much closer and I think open the window for some dialogue on those issues. Now, of course, there are political realities which are a little bit separate, but in principle, I think there are several of those areas that are appreciated, underexplored in terms of potential areas for cooperation. That being said, again, there are political challenges, and that kind of gets back to the subnational and non-state actor point, where I think, not that it's a panacea, not that it's a silver bullet, but I think this is an area in which this kind of different set of actors has a lot of potential to pick up the torch when it comes to trying to encourage some type of dialogue, sort of the track 2, track 1.5 space, particularly on emerging technology issues. I think universities, research institutes have a really, really important and very valuable role to play in in those types of discussions, and I think should seize the opportunity to do so. Again, not a substitute for intergovernmental or diplomatic action, but it's a start, and I think that's where we should, at least in the near term, be investing some energy. The third thing that I came to believe in writing the book is that I think there are a couple of strategies that can improve the prospects for cooperation, and one of them I talk about is the idea of ring fencing, which is really just the idea of trying to sort of get agreement between governments on both sides to essentially try to insulate particular issue areas from politicization and from deterioration in the wider relationship. This is essentially what the US tried to do with climate change. It didn't work. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, as I mentioned, Beijing decided to suspend all climate dialogue with the United States. But I think there are other issue areas where it could work. And I think particularly issue areas that are very technical. One I talk a little bit about in the book, and there's lots to be said about this, but it is an interesting example of relatively effective US-China cooperation, is nuclear security. It's a highly technical, in many ways, even esoteric issue area. Very small number of people who work on it. And I think issues like that, you can conceivably ring fence. And I think that also, mapped to some of these emerging technology areas, there are that can be a promising strategy.
That's a lot to unpack right there. But I think when you mention international collaboration and all the tech sort of advanced technology, feel that you mentioned one thing that we cannot bypass is data security and data privacy. We're a little bit short, but I really want to squeeze in these questions. I think that's one of the topics that both you and Anne have written about in your new books. So how do you see data privacy policy evolving within China, and how might it impact liberal democracy?
Well, I should say I do have a chapter in the book where I try to address some of those issues. Anne has written an entire book which deals with those in much greater detail. And Professor Fu at the beginning of this talk recommended it. I'm also going to recommend it because I read the manuscript, and it is going to be already is an extremely important contribution to understanding China's role in data governance and really in the entire global digital economy. So I really highly commend data trafficking to everyone when it comes out, which will be, I believe, next month or into November. But just to kind of try to tackle that, at least some aspects of that question. And here's again where, I mean, one, I remember saying to somebody when I was writing the book, it's hard to kind of try to write a book whose tagline is essentially "it's complicated," but I feel like that's in some ways the conclusion I came to on a lot of issues. And speaking of nuance, information kind of security is an extremely nuanced issue when it comes to China. Outside China, particularly in the United States, the kind of dominant view and narrative is very much that around things like intellectual property theft, data theft of various kinds, and that is certainly a huge part of the overall situation. But some of the interesting nuance I think that comes in is that on many metrics, data privacy protections, intellectual property protections as well, have actually been improving for many individuals and firms within China, while China-linked actors have posed an increasing threat to the individual data of foreign citizens or people outside China. So in a sense, you've had this kind of export of the potential risk or harm of data privacy infringements. I think it's sort of an interesting shift. Now, I should also be quick to add that it's certainly the case that things like COVID tracking apps and things like that have contributed to a continual strengthening of China's digital surveillance state. So I don't mean to suggest that actually we have all that wrong in terms of an outside view. But it's also true that China has passed, again, fairly aggressive and in some ways quite impressive data privacy legislation that for certain people and sort of in certain situations creates a reasonable kind of legal claim to data privacy. How it's implemented and who benefits from it are very separate questions. But it's nonetheless significant, I think, to note that there has been a lot of regulatory activity in that space. The final thing maybe I'll say in response to that question is, I think where this issue really kind of comes into play is, for me at least, is the 5G kind of telecommunications issue and concerns around the involvement of Chinese firms in building 5G infrastructure. I think it's very easy to overstate the connections between Chinese firms and China's party state. But I think 5G is a slight exception in that there is a much clearer kind of set of relationships that you can chart between particularly Huawei, between China's state and China's diplomatic moves in entities like the ITU that form a really important role in setting norms and standards for global telecommunications networks.
Just before, Lotus, you move on to the next question, I just wanted to press Scott a little bit further here on the point of China advancing in terms of privacy and data security policy. Now, this is going to sound like a very political science question, but you are a political scientist, so I feel like it's fair to ask you. Do you think that within an authoritarian state, I mean, you're just doomed to never really get data security, no matter how many regulations you pass? Because at the end of the day, the authoritarian state can sidestep those regulations and say, if we want data on people's health, if we want data from companies, if we want data from individual people, we're going to get that regardless of regulation. So when or do you think that that's too pessimistic of a standpoint of a take, and you think that looking, because you've worked in the World Bank and you worked in the US context, do you think that also in the States and in other democracies, that privacy regulations come with a lot of challenges and baggage.
You're right to press me on that point, Diana. And I think the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. And I do think it's important to be clear about that, that in an authoritarian system, the authoritarians hold trump cards, so to speak, and no amount of legislation ultimately is going to prevent abuses of power, whether it's the collection of individual personal data, or whether it's the more traditional arresting somebody in the middle of the night and disappearing them. So that is absolutely the case. And I would point out, I do go into some detail on this in the book, that you see particular populations within China, certainly certain minority populations, dissident groups that are exposed to relentless surveillance and detection. And it's utterly, there is absolutely no such thing as privacy of any sort. So I think it's important to be clear about that. I will kind of say that this challenge of data privacy is one, and I think that the end of your question, you alluded to this. It is one that that is something that a lot of countries are tackling, not from the same starting point. China's starting point is very different from that of the United States or the European Union, but nonetheless, there are a lot of thorny challenges and practical challenges to sorting through all those. The one thing I would point out, and I think is kind of shifting more from thinking about surveillance in sort of a rights context into thinking about sort of an economic or technological competitiveness context, is that data is a really, really valuable and important resource. One of the most important resources in the 21st century, and the ability to gather and aggregate lots of very multi-dimensional data is a key input really to technological and economic growth. And so I think it's an interesting challenge for different societies, different political systems, to try to strike the balance of where individual data privacy rights kind of triumph over that value. The final thing that I think is important to note, and it's just purely a practical point, because people love to talk in this space about the sheer number of individual records which Chinese firms and, by extension, presumably the Chinese state, are able to aggregate. And while there is undoubtedly value to that scale, quantity is not the same thing as quality. That's true in a lot of areas of life, and it's also true of data. As important as the kind of sheer number of data sets and sources that you're drawing on are things like diversity. How kind of representative of your population is the data that you have? And how is your data coded? Is it coded in such a way that it can be usefully aggregated and sort of fed into different processes? And it's not clear that China has decisive advantages over other countries in that type of data processing and analytics.
Wow, I think there can be so many sub-questions that come from just one sort of interaction. So do our audience. So I think we'll leave some time for the audience to raise questions. But before that, I just want to pose one final question before I open up the floor. Scott, your latest book looks at the critical intersection of sustainability and technology. What is what is the one big takeaway from your research on China's tech rise?
So the kind of fundamental takeaway that I kind of come to, at least, is the idea that whatever direction relationships between the United States, China, other countries take, whether it's competition, cooperation, some other word starting with C, increasingly you're going to see it, and already do see it, play out in the two domains or dimensions of sustainability and technology. Even older kind of issue areas and tensions are increasingly moving into these domains. And so I think as just sort of a tagline, I would argue that we need to center our thinking about China and the world principally in these two domains of sustainability and emerging technology.
Great. Well, we have lots of questions rolling in, and I would encourage the audience members, now is your chance to pose the question, and I will try my best to get to all of them. So I'm going to go in the order that they were received. The first question is from Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks, essentially, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit, Elizabeth. I think the question is really about competition, right? That in the context of global competition in technology, China is advancing, and it's advancing very quickly. So if other countries, and especially smaller countries or other countries that don't have such advantages, can't keep up, what's the implication of this? What's the worst case scenario? Asks Elizabeth. So I want to pose that to you first, and then we'll move on to the next couple of questions.
I think one implication of it is more kind of regional collective action. And I think actually, the EU is the most obvious example of that. But you see these kind of new groupings that have emerged, whether it's explicitly stated or not, in response to China's rise, the Quad, AUKUS, et cetera, that are kind of essentially subgroupings of predominantly Western countries. And I think that is a natural response to the extent that smaller countries kind of feel threatened or outcompeted or something in that vein by China's rise. One of the natural responses is to attempt that type of regional or interregional collective action. I think a bigger point that occurs to me, and this has been made by others, it's not my novel observation, but that as much as we talk about competition and relative strength and weakness between China and the US and Europe and Japan, probably the more significant global macro trend is that China and many of the developed countries are pulling ahead of essentially the rest of the world when it comes to the digital space, when it comes to development of artificial intelligence. And I think that is exacerbating all of the many inequalities that exist between the developed and developing world. Now, China, is a middle-income country. It remains relatively poor by many metrics. So I'm not necessarily suggesting that China has solved the problem of poverty or underdevelopment. But I think on a lot of metrics, particularly in the tech space, you see kind of China and the developed countries really kind of pulling away from much of the rest of the world. And I think that is going to exacerbate many aspects of global inequality. And I think that's something that deserves a lot more attention and focus.
So I'm going to skip to a question that was actually posed via email by Laurentiu. Sorry if I butchered your name, Laurentiu André. So within Xi's new ideal of technological expansion, technicians in China are working on a plan to monitor the performance of production machines using sensors and cameras and measure it against industrial goals. To what extent do you feel these new technologies will be effective with respect to improving production capabilities and tackling fraud? Now, I'm not sure I myself understand all of those technologies that this person is referring to, but maybe Scott, you have some clue. Yeah.
I think I sort of know, at least in general terms, what this is referring to, which I think is specifically an increasing kind of number of attempts to integrate different types of technology, video, sometimes kind of with an assist from AI and things like that, to sort of try to monitor what people are doing and how processes are performing, but with a sort of performance improvement goal rather than a sort of explicit surveillance goal. Although obviously, that can be dual use. It's really hard to say. I could see that you could generate some performance improvements from that. I would, underscore the fact that the spread of that, unless it's highly regulated, which I wouldn't necessarily trust, frankly, in a Chinese context, would be ripe for abuse, not just by the state, but by unscrupulous, kind of firm or company level leadership, or whatever the kind of unit of organization is there. I suspect, frankly, that type of approach will only have a modest impact on performance or improving industrial processes. I know, for example, there's kind of similar approaches that have been used in some schools to try to track, learning outcomes and student performance and things like that. And I have no insight into what the data shows there, but I'm highly skeptical that that type of approach is any more effective than investing in training teachers to be better teachers.
So I've got a question from a student of mine from Chinese politics. Mark asks, does China have the tech manpower to interpret consumer data, for instance, consumer data that TikTok collects? So it's one thing, to collect data, but does China have the capacity to do something with or aggregate and interpret and analyze the data?
It's a really good question. I think, and the answer is it depends. It depends on what kind of data you're talking about, and I think it gets back to these issues of how is the data coded, and is it sort of structured in a way that it can be easily fed into for machine learning algorithm purposes, for example, algorithm training purposes. The more data is structured in that type of way, the less manpower intensive it is. But I think the question also brings up an interesting, kind of nuance to the digital and tech space, which is it can actually be very manpower intensive, particularly once you get to trying to police online and digital kind of discourse in any way. And certainly U.S. tech firms find that, and that's the case for Chinese tech firms too.
And I'm going to go to another question about Ant Financial. We haven't talked so much specifically about certain firms in China, and of course there was a tech crackdown about a year ago, I think, maybe more. But Santiago asks, have regulatory actions against Ant Financial disrupted the growth and potential expansion of, especially overseas expansion of Chinese mobile payment providers? And is the government now effectively beginning to compete against domestic fintech companies with the introduction of a digital yuan?
So I think with respect to the first question, in short, yes, in the short term, but I think part of the justification is to sort of try to rein in a potential monopolist, and so it's conceivable that could open the door to some creative destruction and innovation in China's mobile payment provider space, and potentially facilitate the growth of internationally competitive providers. But I think in the short term, yes, it did have a negative impact. On the sort of second part of the question, I don't have very intimate knowledge of this area, but my impression, I've been tracking a little bit the digital yuan kind of push, and I think there is, there's certainly some implication of competition, but I don't think as of yet there really is much of a threat against domestic fintech companies from that push.
So I want to pivot a little bit to climate, because that's something I know that you've worked on a lot and is one of the big elephant questions for global cooperation. It's something you wrote about in your book. Another student of mine, Brandon, asks if there's been recent developments or prioritization from the part of China to use more technological approaches to addressing climate issues, like improving decarbonization technology, green technology, so on and so forth, given that climate risk, is a risk for China as it is elsewhere.
Yeah, in short, yes. And the sort of headline climate commitment that China has made is to decarbonize on a net zero basis by 2060. And essentially everyone agrees that that goal is not going to be achievable without some substantial progress and investment in decarbonization technologies, especially areas like hydrogen fuels to help decarbonize the transport sector, for example. So meeting that goal and getting somewhere close to decarbonizing China's economy, the second largest economy in the world, and an extremely energy intensive economy, even in comparison to other countries, will absolutely require major progress in clean technology of many different kinds.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the first topic that we talked about, which is the party state involvement in all of this. And Bob MacArthur asks, surely, sure, there's negotiation between companies and the state, but at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, surely the party state always wins in terms of that negotiation you think of, or you assume that is taking place with two equal partners, but they're not equal partners. In fact, the Chinese state is far more powerful than the companies that they're negotiating with. And the companies, I think, realize that if at the end of the day, they don't comply, they could be gone the next day. So so this is a question for, I guess, Scott, but also Lotus, you brought that question up in the sense that, do we have examples where the negotiation led to a different outcome? Or is it always the case that when the rubber hits the road, the party state gets its way?
I'll let Scott go first. Scott, you wanna take it first?
Well, I think the party state almost always wins when it chooses to compete. But there are kind of two nuances in that response. There are examples of where the party state loses. Admittedly, I haven't found a good one recently, but there's in the tech space. But there's one that I mentioned briefly in the book, and it is very dated now. Anything China and technology, if you try to write about it in a book, which I foolishly did, it's it's outdated as soon as the book comes out. But if you go all the way back to 2008, several lifetimes ago, in the context of China, there was a platform or a kind of essentially it was like an internet filtering system called Green Dam that was put forward and was supposed to be implemented by a certain date and actually was abandoned because of pushback from Chinese internet companies at the time. So you can find a few examples, again, admittedly not recently that I'm aware of, but there are some cases. I think the bigger and better response to the question is that, a key thing to remember for any authoritarian system, and really, I guess, any political system to some degree, coercive resources are limited. In an authoritarian system, typically the authoritarian does have trump cards to play, but as a practical matter, and this is certainly true in an economy, a society, a country as diverse and large as China's, you don't want to, nor can you employ those resources most of the time. You reserve them for areas that are particularly important. And so I think it's with that realization that the kind of negotiation and the differences in interests between firms and the party state comes into play. But Lotus, what do you think?
I think to add on and going back to the points that you raised during our discussion is there are a lot of government agencies involved. So even when we're talking about party states, we're looking at, say, different level government. the power of a central government and the power of local government, regional government is very different. And the negotiation processes or the discussion process and even the implementation process between regional government and private company versus central government and private company is also very different. So while I do think at the end of the day, central government have a lot of power over, obviously guiding the direction and regulating private company, when it comes to day-to-day operation on a regional or local level, the pictures are much more nuanced. And also a very dated example, and I don't want to misquote that. I think there was a Financial Times article actually looking at Ant Financial and perhaps Tencent as well, the kind of negotiation process of these two financial fintech company when government trying to access the data that these companies have acquired, and there were sort of back and forth between the private company and the government. So there definitely is this kind of negotiation or this kind of like back and forth processes. And I do believe that the relationship between states and private company is much more nuanced than is often, pictured.
Right. So moving right along, I think we might only have time for one, maybe 1.5 questions. I wanted to get to a question that really gets to the theme of this panel, which is disruption of the tech world. Like, what do we mean by China is disrupting the tech world, right? Is it maybe the US that's disrupting the tech world instead? Like, do we mean that China is disrupting the tech, like, policy norms around technology, around the idea that the internet should be sovereign? What do we really mean by the role of China as a potential disruptor of the global informational sphere? Is this really the right terminology and framework with which to look at China?
So I think there are two kind of big things there. One is really kind of more a matter of perception, and I think arguably unjustified alarm. And that really has to do with the fact that across pretty much every technology area, every metric of innovation, research and development, the gap between China and advanced high-income countries is shrinking and shrinking very, very fast. And that's certainly true of the United States. Although I would also add that contrary to popular belief, it seems there is still a gap on almost every metric. And that gap gets bigger the closer you get to the cutting edge of almost any given technology. So, I think there's very little good evidence for the common assertion that, China is sort of somehow outstripping the US or other advanced economies when it comes to innovation or science or technology. The other, I think, aspect to that question, though, which is a little bit more substantive, is the concern that, having said that about the sort of gap, China is an indispensable central player in every technology, and there is no such thing as a global norm or standard or a global regulation of a technology without China. And the concern that enters in there is, are you going to have China try to codify norms and standards that reflect authoritarian values, essentially, or at least authoritarian practices around information control, surveillance, et cetera. And I think that's a little bit more substantive. Although, frankly, I think, again, good evidence of where that has actually come to play is somewhat limited. I think 5G is the major exception to that, where I think there is some evidence of an attempt that looks something like that. But I think those are the two things I would say on that.
Lotus, any last words?
No, I think that captures it very nicely. I would just actually, can I go back to the last questions about the party states kind of business? One of the examples and studies I think everyone should look at in terms of looking at how the relationship in sort of display in day-to-day operation is a research by Blake Miller. So he had a leaked database of Weibo directive when it comes to implementing censorship ordered by government. And you see a lot of sort of company pushback in terms of implementing those directives. Sometimes company actually choose to not to implement those because of say commercial reason or because other reason. So I think those are some good examples of looking at the nuances and actual examples of nuances of party-state relationship as displayed in day-to-day company operation.
Right. So where there's policy, there's always pushback to policy from below. I just want to thank Scott and Lotus once again for joining us. And I especially want to thank the audience who stayed with us and asked so many interesting questions. Really, really encourage you to read Scott's book as well as Anne's book, and to stay attuned to what Lotus has been working on with the Citizen Lab here at the University of Toronto. I hope that you'll join me once again. We have a number of exciting panels coming up that are either sponsored directly by us or co-sponsored. So please be on the lookout. Our next co-sponsored event will be with the Japan Center here, and it will be let's see, it'll be on Friday, September 30th at 3:30 with our speaker being Adam Liff. So thank you once again, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.